That's what the film shows. You know, he's got his fist clasped, and then he lets go, and he lets go. But in fact, what this symbolizes, that is the nonviolence training that civil rights movement activists got, especially after Montgomery, is something that people had to learn. They went to schools for this. They went to trainings for this. They went to series of educational programs in churches for this. One of my colleagues at GW, Jim Horton, is an African-American historian who is also African-American, and he talks about how he didn't get involved in this component of the civil rights movement because he failed the nonviolence training. Like, he couldn't do it. So, you know, he just did some other stuff because he found that training, that requirement to let go of your hands that way, just too hard. So in this, again, there's a kind of tendency, I think, in a lot of histories of the civil rights movement to de-emphasize organizing, de-emphasize movements, de-emphasize the work it takes to make a movement. But in order to make this kind of also very powerful point about nonviolence, they do it by kind of individualizing it and separating it out from the hard work of social movement. So I really like this movie, and I like this clip because of what it shows, but the inaccuracies, they don't bother me because they're inaccuracies, but you want to, you know, because that's not so important, but what the implications of that, the story of that is about kind of these morally superior people, right? This is a morally superior kid. He's just better than most of us, instead of what it took to teach people to do this really, really hard thing, that is to engage in nonviolence. Yeah, and so the other thing that think about this, that this I think mistakenly, or it's not a mistake, but it doesn't quite show us, is the ways in which nonviolence was activism. It wasn't victimization. So in the sense that people are getting hit or hurt or killed, as we'll see later on in one of the clips, it's obviously victimization. But nonviolent organizers planned places to go and strategies to enact in order to provoke situations of conflict, in order to show the violence of segregation and racism in very highlighted ways. That's to say, they didn't ask to get themselves hurt, but they set up situations like the Woolworths counter, right? When people went and sat down at Woolworths counter, they knew, they expected that they weren't going to get served a hamburger that day. They expected to have some kind of confrontation, and they were prepared for that. And they wanted to highlight not only the fact that they couldn't get a hamburger at Woolworths, but to highlight the violence of the everyday violence of segregation. And when people came and actually hit them and threw eggs on them and tried to knock them off those seats, and they refused to fight back, but also refused to leave, they were not victims. They were organizers. They were strategists. They were people making a movement. And I think that's a history I often really try to tell in my own work, and that, you know, sometimes it's hard to get in even the best of these films. So the pros and the cons, right? I'm going to turn then to talk about the possibilities of teaching about and focusing on the Black liberation movement and civil rights activism in the North, which is a very important part of this story, and one that I also think sometimes is taught or taught to us with some limitations and inaccuracies. I'm going to suggest a couple of clips from Malcolm X that you might be able to teach in class. You have a better sense of this than me. But one of the things I think is really useful about the film Malcolm X is that in this film, it's really clear that the activism, that Malcolm X's activism and the activism of the Black liberation movement and the Nation of Islam was coterminous with, simultaneous with the civil rights movement in the South. It didn't something that happened later. We didn't have civil rights and then black power or black nationalism. These things both emerged as alternative or simultaneous ways of thinking about black liberation in the 1950s, in the late 1950s and early 1960s. They are both very, very active. And so one of the things that this film does, I think, is make that very clear. And it also makes clear in all sorts of ways how the black nationalist movement saw itself in opposition to or in difference from the civil rights movement. And so we can get some sense of how, because I think the film is fairly close to the vision that Malcolm X himself tries to present in his autobiography with Alex Haley. I don't think it's necessarily the only way to think about the Nation of Islam, but I think it's gives a really good sense of some of the issues that people like Malcolm X or other black nationalist activists, or just generally activists in the urban North, how they saw civil rights, how they saw what the issues were, and how they saw themselves in some ways as opposing the strategies of the Southern-based civil rights movement. The Nation of Islam was founded in 1930, and Elijah Muhammad, who is the leader when Malcolm X is involved, takes over in 1934, and he stays the leader until 1975. So for a large part of its most visible period, the Nation of Islam was led by this guy, Elijah Muhammad. And Malcolm X got involved in the Nation of Islam when he got out of jail in 1952. So before Montgomery, right, he's already getting involved in this alternative to what at this point wasn't an alternative to the civil rights movement, but was an alternative religion to Christianity. He became a Muslim of a certain type. And as you'll see here, a kind of way of organizing one's sense of self that is very, I won't say it's very different, that is different in certain ways, in certain key ways, from the ways that the civil rights movement presented itself or taught people to see themselves. It's very much, and this is a scene I think it becomes very clear. In this scene, I'd like you to think about comparing marches. Somebody talked earlier about the number of marches that were already happening by the late 50s and how successful they were or weren't. Well, this is a scene of a march, a very different kind of march from some of the civil rights marches that were taking place in this time. In this scene, one of the Nation of Islam members has been beaten and arrested and taken to jail. And this is Malcolm X going to the jail and trying to see him. And I want you to look here at both the comparison of the other marches that people would have known about and also masculinity, which is hard to miss. So, any thoughts about that particular scene? What's going on there? Why is it, well, I think it's a pretty powerful scene. So what's interesting about it? What's going on there that you find, that you have any thoughts about?
There's really a lot involved in that scene, and involved in that movement, from the religion to, and right before the scene, the woman challenged him to go do something. Muslims never do anything, and also the difference between men and women in the Nation of Islam. There's a lot in that scene, and it'll be a lot
to unpack there. Right. Well, there's a lot of stuff about women in the thing about women's place and his wife's role, but here it's that line of men, just the fruit of Islam, right? Just standing up there, setting the tone. Yeah.
Conveys a mob mentality. People even recognize what they're there for, and when they're cheering for like a broad. I don't even remember what they were saying. We want justice. Do they even know what they're standing there for? If anything, that's portraying the people of not ignorance, but like questionably blindly following belief.
You mean, in other words, they might not know that Brother Johnson is in the. Mm-hmm.
If anything, I'd be afraid that we were portraying the movement in a negative way.
Oh, so if you showed this, you would think maybe it showed that people in this movement were just.
Mob mentality, yeah, follow whomever, and we cover that, and how it leads to leaders and such. It'd be misleading without something to solid background.
See what other people think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good scene. Malcolm X, he's such a controversial, edgy figure. A lot of kids find that interesting to learn. With the clip, you got Denzel Washington. Kids nowadays know he's such a great actor that they get that much more into it. So I think it's a very useful clip for the study.
I think, just as a comment about that, I think Spike Lee used Denzel Washington because he had the reputation of being this very genial person, actor, you know, people have very warm feelings towards Denzel Washington. And so then Spike Lee had this particular vision about Malcolm X, that it was a very positive vision. I think choosing Denzel Washington as the actor for that, besides the fact that he's an extraordinary actor, really helped the sort of him produce the vision of Malcolm X he did in the film.
Adding on to Cindy's point, I think that's a good comment you made about what the students would think about that, and maybe you could add to a discussion, make that as part of your discussion of what the meaning of the whole clip is about, and whether they thought, well, are these people going out because they know who Malcolm X is, or are they just following, you know, what do you think about that? And that, you know, you could get a pretty good analysis of that whole thing.
I think the thing with the mob, though, is like, for those people at that time in that place to see the powerful black image, that they just wanted to follow it. You know, they saw those guys, they looked so dignified, they dressed so well, they carried themselves in a certain way, and I want to follow that, you know.
I identified with the second film a lot more as maybe my maleness.
As an angry young man, you'd like to say.
Right, yeah. But it made me think also about the importance of media in terms of how they captured both images of the nonviolence movement versus Malcolm X movement, and how that was perceived by America at the time.
When you say how they, in terms of media, how they captured it, do you mean how the two films worked in terms of filming, or?
Well, I was thinking in particular about the Woolworths image of nonviolence movement versus the other image, and how that would seem to capture people and be powerful images of, and at least brought out, I don't know if sympathy is the right word, but captured the minds of the American public more.
One of the reasons I chose them is the different models of discipline, what discipline means. You know, for that boy, letting go of his hands is discipline. It's an active discipline, as nonviolence was an extraordinary discipline. And in this, discipline means something else, right? It means those men who are dressed well and do what they're told because they are part of a disciplined community. And so, in
perfect unison.
Yes, and with drumming, you know, that probably wasn't there. And I also think that we can also say that, see, I would read this scene where people are coming out from the movie theaters and saying, you know, let's see what's happening, as again a kind of truncation of people joining the movement for, you know, black nationalism or black liberation in the North, so that people, you know, that see it as a kind of symbolism of all sorts of people who are coming to join this movement, not necessarily, you know, again, sort of reading the film as a film, as providing a kind of symbolic moment where all sorts of people are coming out and stepping behind the Nation of Islam and supporting it, and then, you know, following Malcolm X when he also says it's enough, we're gonna move on.
Well, they see he's getting results too. I mean, immediate results, you know, from the police. And those the men too, even though they were intimidating, they were also practicing nonviolence. They were very disciplined in that way too.
Yeah, and in fact, one of the things that people have commented on about the Nation of Islam is that, you know, it doesn't commit acts of violence. It talks about things. Malcolm X talks about a lot of things, that the right to certain kinds of behaviors, but he doesn't organize, you know, any political violent acts. Not really even that many political actions. Somebody else? All right, I want to show you one more scene from the movie. Go ahead.
I was going to say the use of sound was interesting in the movie. I know when they were showing the police station, there was this very annoying, almost melodious tune playing. It was, I don't know what I don't even know the song, but it sort of captured maybe, I don't know, almost the indifference of being inside a police station, but yet Malcolm X has a reason to be there, and then suddenly the music changed to the marching sound. I think it was just an interesting contrast from the two different types of sound that they.
I noticed the music in this movie too. It seems very effective.
I saw the light difference too. Like this, there was a lot of color in this, and this is very dark, shadowy. You know, the scene is, especially the whole movie is.
But you know, also the police station is that bright kind of fluorescent light, you know, unattractive as in here. And then you go into even the night, though it's warm, right? There's a kind of warmth to that dark. And the people, you see their faces as you go along with the camera and see the shining faces of the young men, you know, or medium-aged men. And so there's that kind of warmth to it too, even though it's also dark, or at least that's how I read it. It's that positive feeling we're invited to have. All right, so let me just quickly set up a next scene for us. This is probably the most didactic scene of the ones I'm showing you, and one of the most didactic in the movie. And it directly takes up the question of how the folks how Malcolm X saw himself as different than the civil rights movement. And it directly takes up his critique of the civil rights movement. It also lays out some of he's giving some speeches where he lays out some of his differences with and it lays out some of the basic views of the Nation of Islam. One of the things I'll just point you to before we watch it is this set of things we're about to watch is clearly not a linear narrative. It's clearly not chronological. There's stuff happening on top of each other. And that's one of the things I think is kind of interesting about how it works. Again, telescoping certain kinds of things. So.